The risk, obviously, with some of the right-wing populists, and that's a risk across the Atlantic as well as here, is their desire to come to terms with Putin on terms that might be much more appealing to Putin than he would currently get.
As the European Union faces European Parliament elections, and this week a report by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Berlin-based think tank, forecasts that anti-EU populists will either be the largest party or dominant in 18 of the 27 EU member states. So what would this so-called political earthquake across the continent this June look like, and how might it affect us? Sir Ivan Rogers was the British permanent representative to the EU under David Cameron, and Theresa May. Welcome to joining us here on Times Radio.
Good morning.
First of all, do you share the misgivings that are reflected in this European Council on Foreign Relations survey that there is a storm coming of a rise of populism in the European Union?
Well, I don't know whether they're misgivings. I think it's a very interesting piece of work, analysis and polling. I think it's quite likely to be reasonably accurate. I think Europe is collectively going to move further to the right, and the conventional right, if I can put it like that, a combination of the Gaullists and the Christian Democrats, are suffering a bit, although they will gain some seats in Spain, I think, and no doubt one or two other places. And it's various elements of the more populist further right that are likely to gain most. And the Social Democrats will, I suspect, lose ground. Probably Emmanuel Macron's more centrist party may lose ground as well. So I think the analysis is probably pretty accurate. There comes the question of what that might mean if it happens.
Well, exactly. That's what I was going to ask you, because the consequences of that presumably affect the balance of power in the European Parliament, and that in turn will affect who gets the big jobs in the European Commission. Could
well do. I think the smart money is probably still on Ursula von der Leyen coming back for a second term as Commission President, but that's not a sure thing. We've already seen Charles Michel, the current President of the Council, who wanted to stand for the European Parliament, withdraw from that. That's more related to the risks around Viktor Orban having the rotating presidency of the EU in the second half of the year. But it's, it'll be complex on top jobs. I think the bigger issue for me, and I think for all of your listeners and everybody else, is really what might it mean for Ukraine? Above all, of course, the appetite in the EU to supply arms and to ensure that Ukraine can come out ahead in this war. The risk, obviously, with some of the right-wing populists, and that's a risk across the Atlantic as well as here, is their desire to come to terms with Putin on terms that might be much more appealing to Putin than he would currently get. So that's a big risk. Then beyond the war, assuming we ever get beyond the war, you get the massive potential costs of Ukrainian reconstruction. And then the big issue, of course, for the next 5 years in Europe really is enlargement. And the current EU bosses are talking about the geostrategic imperative of bringing Ukraine into the EU, which when I was there 7 or 8 years ago was absolutely unimaginable, even after Crimea, but it's now become an imperative for the European Union. Does that fade as an imperative if more right-wing populists, above all in Central and Eastern Europe, but also more broadly, get into power? Because these guys have, on the whole, not been enthusiasts for the idea of enlarging to Ukraine.
Well, let's talk about countries. Let's start with the big ones. Do you expect that there will be a real resurgence by Marine Le Pen's movement in France, for example?
Yeah, one would think so. I mean, she's well ahead in the current opinion polls. There's obviously a considerable possibility that she stands again for the presidency at the end of Macron's term for 2027, and that she has a young and telegenic potential prime minister. So there is a risk of that. And anyway, European elections, as they used to be here, often tend to be quite strong protest votes. People don't necessarily vote on European issues. It's the opportunity in many countries to give the government of the day a good kicking. So I think it's quite likely they will come out with a very strong showing. Same must apply to the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, which is a far-right group. Again, like Le Pen, very hard to think of them as entirely reliable on the Russia-Ukraine question, but at the moment the AfD is running over 20% in German opinion polls and well ahead of the current SPD government.
UK seems to be going in a different direction at the moment, with Labour being well ahead in the polls. Labour is talking about having a more constructive relationship with the European Union. If, as we're talking about, this poll is right and we do get more populist right-wing nativist parties emerging in the member states of the European Union, is that going to make life harder for a possible Keir Starmer government?
Possibly, but not necessarily, I would say. I think if we compare today and next year, when it gets serious, if Keir Starmer is in office, with the circumstances of 2016, even after Crimea, if you did have Donald Trump in the White House, Europe faces some big questions on defense capability, defense spending, on security, on collective security. And then the question of whether the British are reliable, serious, strategic security partners, including in Eastern Europe, becomes a rather critical one for the whole of the European Union. And that's just as true for the populist right as for the kind of mainstream centrist, centre-left, centre-right. So I think there is an opportunity there potentially for Labour, above all, perhaps in circumstances where Trump re-emerges, that Europe has suddenly to get much more serious about its defence capability, about rearmament, sadly. I think we are in a rearmament decade. We are in a period which feels a rather more like the interwar period or a pre-war period than the calm that we had for 20 or 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And then the question of where the British are and whether there are deals to be done with an incoming British government becomes a pretty serious question for the European Union, I think.
And just quickly, Sir Ivan, your old boss, David Cameron, is back as Foreign Secretary. Are you pleased about that?
Well, I think he, as you would expect me to say, I enjoyed working for him at a personal level. I think he's a very capable and serious figure. He's extremely energetic. He knows a lot of the players, not just in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, because he was Prime Minister for a long period. And at a time of immense kind of geostrategic turmoil, which I'm afraid we're living in, that's no doubt pretty valuable for the current Prime Minister, because he can take a huge amount of the strain on multiple crises running at once.